This is Takadox, my favorite Bionicle Barraki villain from the iconic Undersea world of Mahri Nui. He's got these really fun marbled glow-in-the-dark armor parts that have got me itching to revamp this set. So today, let's upgrade Takadox, and even throw in a squid for good measure. Let's start by upgrading his head. First, we need to remove the existing details, so that we can add in our own. This leaves me with a pretty great starting point. For the eyes, I'll go for a more robotic look, using some red bars and a rounded plate. Attaching these in, and I really like how they look like cybernetic enhancements. For his mouth, instead of leaving it with a random opening, I want to fill it in with this mini doll cape part. Now, let's build up some structure to hold that cape in place, and for the neck joint. I'll use a rod with a Technic connector and a ball joint on it, so that it can pivot and lock the cape in later. Let's add another connector and some pin axles to connect it into the head, remembering to add the cape first, of course. Now, we just need to add the mechanical mandibles. For them, I first need to steal some minifigure tools. Namely, these binoculars and pick. Let's attach them together and then add this funky part, a robot arm, and this bar. That rounds out our mandibles, apart from some cables which I want to add in when we do the final assembly. Let's clip them in to round out the head assembly. I think that's a pretty good upgrade to the original head. Next up, let's steal his praying mantis weapon parts to upgrade them. I'll begin by extending them with a few Technic connectors. We can add one of these marbled glow-in-the-dark armor parts to it here, and then add a ball joint for the wrist connection. For some mechanical detail, I'll construct a piston with a rod end and a bar. Then we can add a few more spikes, which I'll connect in with some minifigure neck brackets. With that, our mantis blade is done, and we can start in on the arms. For the upper arms, let's begin with a large Technic panel. I'll connect in some half pins for a rounded plate and some robot hands to attach into. To those, let's clip a T-bar. Here, I'll add a ball joint for the shoulder. Then, we can temporarily detach it to add in an axle, and then connect it back in. After, I'll attach a lift arm and an axle connector. Then, we can add in a pin, and attach this bushing stud assembly to make a strong connection into this rod and piston body. For the shoulder armor, let's use some more glow-in-the-dark parts. Let's add in some red barbs, like the original set head. Next, I'll add a connector and a pin to attach our next mechanical detail, this piston. On the one end, I'll connect this rounded plate. The problem here is that there's not enough clutch to securely hold it. To get around this, I'll add in a bar, and then complete the piston sandwich with this open stud. With that, let's attach it into the arm. Since I kinda covered up the original socket I was gonna use, let's add in this double ball joint, and then a double socket to complete the shoulder. Next, let's build up a squid friend to go along with Takadox, while I tell you about Iconic, the sponsor of today's video. If you've ever gone through a data breach, it's a little like spilling your bricks all over the place. Data brokers can collect your info, and then make it available for purchase by businesses, and it could even fall into the hands of criminals. These data brokers aggregate your personal information, including your names, login credentials, and more. Iconic, the sponsor of today's video, can help you take back control of the situation and pick up the pieces of your life. Iconic does this by reaching out to data brokers on your behalf and requesting your personal data be removed. If you've ever had to deal with the annoying robocalls, it's likely that your info was sold to a company by one of these data brokers. Even crazier is health insurance companies could actually raise your rates based on your online activity by teaming up with data brokers. The good news is that you have the right to protect your privacy and request that data brokers delete the information they hold about you. The bad news is that it would take you years to do it manually. Iconic takes care of all this for you and makes sure that your data stays off the market by conducting repeated removal requests. Iconic will continue to protect your data privacy as long as you use the service. Take your personal data back with Iconic. Use code mitch.builds at the link below to get 60% off an annual plan. With the tentacles done, let's connect in the squid head. For eyes, I have this Speed Champion sticker sheet, which I think will have something which we can use. I like to use a minifigure crowbar to apply the stickers without getting fingerprints on them. With the eyes added, our squid is done, and I just need to build a stand to hold him. Here, I'll use a pair of clear rods, which I can add a rod end to one side of, and build up a base for the other side. Let's clip in our squid, and then we can get back to completing the arms. Let's start off the lower arm with a snot brick, which I'll attach some rods to. For the armor, I have this large wing part we can use. Let's detail it by adding some cheese slopes. Then, I can click in a ratchet joint and a robot hand to connect to the bars later. But one connection point isn't going to cut it, so let's build up a sub-assembly of clips and snot bricks to attach into the wing. With that connected in, we can clip it into the lower arm. To build the wrist joint, I'll snap 2 mixel arms together. Then add some clips to one of them. To the other, I'll attach in a plate and a bracket to hold one last clip. Now that bit can connect into the rest of the arm, and we can assemble the arms together. I like how we're really exaggerating the praying mantis look of the original Takadox model. Now that that's done, we can move on to the legs. Let's start by building up some claws. First, by adding some robot hands and arms to this Hero Factory foot. After, I'll clip in some rod ends. We can connect some of these funky bar parts to them. And then, finally add in the claws. I like to add these rubber lift arms to the bottom of the feet so that there's a little more friction against the floor. I'll connect it in with an axle and then add a pin through the other side, which expands the lift arm so that it sticks out a bit and we get that increased traction. I'll start the lower legs by connecting a pair of sockets together. Then we can connect in a long axle to thread a cone onto. Next, let's add some ball joints and a red spike. I'll use this Star Wars shin part for the back of the calf. I like the texture that this gives the front side of the lower legs. To make these legs digigrade, let's use some Technic cams and a doubled up ball joint to get a strong knee. Now we can connect that into the lower leg. Then let's connect in his foot. For the hip joints to be strong, I'll again double up some ball and socket joints. However, the setup I usually go for has a problem that the center of rotation for the thigh is not in line with the hip joint. This can lead to some funky posing, so I want to see if we can do better here. Luckily, LEGO makes this ratcheting joint, which should fit the build pretty well here. The center of rotation is now aligned with the hip joint. The only issue is that it connects in with pins rather than axles, so we need to come up with some other way of immobilizing it. Let's start by giving this broken lift arm a new lease on life. I'll connect a stopper axle and add some bushings to it. The stopper helps to shim the small bit of slop, which would otherwise be in this connection. Then, let's do some hip surgery. And instead of adding a titanium plate, let's add a half pin and a connector. We can connect things back together, and then add a few more connectors, which can accept an axle and a few Technic bits. With that done, we've effectively locked the rotation of those pin joints, and we're ready to start constructing the upper leg. For that, we can start with the Technic wheel and add some stopper axles and cams. I like using stopper axles when I can, because they make for a more sturdy final assembly when parts can only slide off of one side. Let's add a few more Technic components and some wheels. Let's add more detail starting by adding some pins to a lift arm. Then, let's attach this fin and a macaroni. A little surgery and we can connect it in. Now, it's time to attach that into our hip joint. We can rotate it around freely to get whatever pose we want for the final product. Next, let's add some pins to this corrugated tube. I'll connect one end to the hip joint and the other to the upper leg. This makes for a fun effect when we rotate the leg. Now, to bring in some glow-in-the-dark blue, let's use this nocturne head. Onto it, I'll add a little assembly of a T-bar, droid arms, and a shoulder armor plate. Then, we can add a large red spike to the other side. Up next, we need something to cover up the hip joint, but with enough clearance to still rotate around the joint. Let's start with these two slope parts. I'll connect them together with some plates and a boat stud. For the connection to the leg, I'll use this Technic panel and a pin axle. One last slope can round out this armor. Let's connect that in and see how it does pivoting around the joint. For the knee, I'll add in some sockets. I also want to add one more glow-in-the-dark part, but I'm out of connection points. Let's swap in a longer axle, then use a minifigure neck bracket. The armor can connect here, but it's a weak connection, so we can strengthen it with this rod and a stud to hold things in place. Now let's connect the leg together, starting with the knee, then the lower leg, and finally we can snap in the foot. With our legs done, it's time to start on the leg. This dinosaur leg is a weird part that I've always wanted to use. I think here it could work really well for the torso. Two of them together like this makes for a sickly design that feels at home on Takadox. The fun part will be connecting them together and building some structure for the torso. Let's start off with some Technic. These connectors have a little cutout which will allow for them to pivot when the legs are connected in. We're starting to get there, but currently the legs flop all over the place, so we need another way to connect them in. We'll need to build up some more structure to properly hold them. Our problem is that there's only one connection point on these legs. To get around that, let's build up a little assembly with a rubber lift arm. Now we can slide the rubber lift arm over these dino claws. I've built this with a ball joint, so we just need to connect it in with a socket on the other side to get whatever angle we need. Let's build up some structure so that we have a place to later add some sockets. A long axle can support a pair of triaxles, which our sockets can connect into. Now let's reattach our dino legs and swing them in place. That's much stronger. Up next, I want to add some tubes to follow the curve of the leg parts. A little minor surgery can get us a spot to attach one end in. For the second, I'll use this fancy pin. We can attach it to the triaxle. Circling back to the head for a second, I have these cables I want to connect from the mandible to the torso. I think now would be a good time to figure out where they connect into the body. But let's add them in later so that we don't have them flopping around in the meantime. Now, we need a neck connection. First, let's attach some pin axles and cams. Then, we can build up a little assembly around this modified Technic beam. Let's attach that in, and then cap things off, using this beautiful dark blue Rakshi foot. I'll add a socket here, and then a half pin to connect into our existing structure. Up next, I want to add a funky glow-in-the-dark growth to Takadox's back. These nocturne heads should be perfect. First, let's add some spikes. Then, I'll connect a pair of axles to attach in another head. This really limits the connection points we have available, so we'll have to use one of the remaining pinholes to attach the rest of the body. Now let's build up a connecting assembly with some T-bars and rounded plates so that we can pose this as needed. Let's connect that into the Nocturne heads, and then we can attach it in and move it into place. Now, we really need some shoulder joints. Let's keep them simple with a stopper axle, ball joint, and some Technic. Let's connect that in. Now, moving on to the hips, we need 2 sets of ball joints. Let's thread them onto this axle suspended in a flip-flop beam. To the beam, I'll add a number of Technic connectors so that we can attach this into the rest of the body. For Takadox's belly, let's build up a droid arm based assembly, which can hold this shoulder armor. Let's clip that in and flip it into place. Next, it'd be nice to hide this exposed beam. Let's do that with a dino tail and an elephant trunk. Then, I'll add some Technic to this end to attach things into the torso at the correct angle. That finishes off the torso, and we can move on to building up a tail. For this, I want to use one more dino appendage, these pterodactyl wings. I'll add some clips to them, and then a snot brick so that we can attach the two together. Currently, we have a big gap down the middle, so let's temporarily remove one wing to fill in the interior. For some glow-in-the-dark details, let's add some spikes to this armor. Then, I'll add Technic brick and a clip, which can attach to a rod end and rod before connecting into the tail. For the final bit here, let's construct a similar rod end assembly with a bunch of clips. 2 of these can hold some more wings, and then the final one can take another rod end and a T-bar. Finally, we can clip in this motorcycle fairing. Afterwards, we can connect this in, and then, after replacing the wing, the tail is done, and we're ready for the final assembly. Let's try attaching in the tail. Oops! Let's try connecting that piece by piece. Next, let's add in our cables. And then the head can connect to the torso and those cables. Now, let's snap on the legs. Finally, the arms can click in, and it's time for the beauty shots. Thanks to all the amazing people supporting me over on Patreon. You are the building blocks that make this channel possible. And special shout out to my newest patrons, Bardia, Jalair, and Michael. Thanks again to Iconic for sponsoring today's video. Use code mitch.builds at the link below to get 60% off an annual plan. If you like this video, YouTube thinks you'll enjoy this one too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. But until then, happy building.